Hello, and welcome to our video on the king. The king is the most important player in the game. If anything happens to the king, you have to respond to that. You have no choice but to deal with threats to the king over top of all else. We're going to look at where the king starts on the board. Pretty simple there on the e-file. How the king moves. We're going to look at a very special, a threat to the king is called check. We'll look at that. We'll look at how the king captures, and then we will look briefly at castle. It's something that we have to get familiar with, but we're not going to go into extreme detail on this video. Okay, so first of all, the kings are the guys with the crosses on their head here, and you see here that the kings start off on the e-file. One thing that kind of helps you set up chessboards, if you don't have that notation, is queens go on their own color. So we have a light queen here and a light king. The light queen goes on the light color. The king goes on the e-file, or the opposite of their color. And the kings are positioned straight across from each other. How the king moves. So the king can move one space in any direction. So I'm just putting some kings on the board. And so this king can go forward, he can go backwards. All chess pieces can go forward and backwards, except for the pawns. The pawns, which we'll see very soon in our next video, they can only go straight forward. But this king can go to 8 different squares. This white king can go to 8 different squares from where he is. So you can go back to all 3 of these squares on the second rank. He could drop back like this. He could go left or right onto the 3rd rank, or he can go to all 3 squares here on the 4th rank. What he can't do is move into check. So if I step forward here, now the black king cannot move to any square on the 5th rank. He can't move to these squares up here because he'd be moving into what we would call check. And check is a special thing where the king is in danger. It's a big deal. You can't do it. It's absolute. In fact, if you have an opponent and he does something like this, which is just gross, I can't, that never happens actually in chess. But if somebody does this, you have to say, hey, you're in check. You can't move there. You can't just capture the king. That's not how chess is played. You have to tell them, hey, you're in check. You can't do that. They'll have to move, whoops. They will have to move back and come up with some other move. You can never put your king in danger. Anytime you put your king in danger, it's called check. In fact, your opponent is supposed to tell you, hey, you're in check. You can't do that. That's what that term check comes from. A lot of times when you attack a king, people will say check, but you don't necessarily have to say check. It's not a rule that you have to say check. But if they go to make some sort of illegal move, they move some other piece, you say, hey, you're in check. And they have to move their king. A king captures just like any other piece, and the pawns actually attack diagonally. So they move forward and attack diagonally. We'll get in more detail on that in another section. But if this pawn moves forward, it is technically checking the king now. So if white had some other piece here and they decided they wanted to move this pawn, that's not legal. They can't move that pawn over there right now because this pawn has the king in check. So we must respond to the checking move. In this case, it's pretty simple. The king can just capture it. The king could just capture that pawn. And in chess, almost entirely, there's one case we'll meet with the pawn, but almost entirely you occupy the square of the piece you capture. We capture a piece, you then occupy the square of the piece that captured you. So if there was this pawn that was here, they don't magically appear like this, but if there was a pawn that was here and it attacked us, we would just then occupy the square. And I'm just dropping pawns out of nowhere, I realize, but so this doesn't actually happen in chess. But if there was already a pawn here, and now they move here and put us in check, we can't actually capture this pawn because the king is protecting that pawn. If we moved our king to the square f6 where this pawn is, capturing the pawn, the king would be able to capture us. So that's not legal. You just can't do it. If somebody tries to capture a pawn like that, put kings next to kings. Kings can never be next to kings. That would be putting us in check. But if this pawn was over here instead, yeah, we could just go ahead and capture. The king can capture. Sometimes I've seen students where come and put them in check with, say, a rook, which we'll meet later. The rook can move across files like this, or he could capture this pawn. But if he did something like this, this is just a bad move. It's checking the king, but kings can capture if they're right next to him, and this rook is unguarded, so we could just go ahead and capture. So that's king captures. Okay, so there's another very important and strange move that the king can do, and we're just going to go into this briefly here. So it's called castling, and here, if it was white's move, he could actually, since there's no pieces between the king and the rook, and assuming that the king and the rook he's castling with have never moved in the game, we could actually move our king over 2 spaces towards the rook, and the rook would actually come on to the other side like this. And this is called castling, and the idea is to kind of get the king out of harm's way, to get the king protected behind a nice wall of pawns here where he can't be put in check. The battle in the opening is to try to take over the center of the board, and so a lot of times this center of the board will open up, and it's just dangerous for the king to be in his starting position there on the e file. And in this case, white could actually castle to either side. In both cases, the king would move over 2 squares, so to castle to the king's side of the board, he would move to g1. To move to the queen's side of the board, castle queen side, he would move to c1. And the rook just comes on the other side. Now, you can't castle if you're in check at the moment. So if somebody puts you in check, you can't castle out of check. As long as you don't move your king, you could castle later on. If you block that check, you could possibly castle in the future, just not if you are in check at the time. Now, white could castle to the queen side of the board, so the queen is on the d file, so A through D is called the queen side. E through H, that's the king side of the board. So white could castle either direction here, but black could only castle to the queen side because his own bishop's in the way. If white wanted to castle, he could castle to the king side or queen side. We'll choose the king side here. Now, you always want to move your king first if you are going to castle, and then put the rook on the other side. That's in tournament play, it has to be done like that. And black could, of course, castle to the queen side. He couldn't castle to the king side because his bishop was in the way. And notice that the king side castle, there is just 1 space on the other side of the king, and queen side castling, there's 2 spaces. So sometimes people call it castling short is king side, and castling long is queen side. So that's castling. We're going to cover this again when we talk about the rook here in the next several chapters down the way. Alright, so that is castling, and that is our introduction to the king. If you found this video informative, please like and subscribe, as I will be putting out new videos every Monday and Thursday at least. Thanks for watching, and have an excellent